In the quiet town of Oakshade, nestled in upstate New York, you'd think nothing bad ever happened. The kind of place where neighbors still borrow sugar from each other, and the local diner knows your order before you sit down. But everything changed one Sunday morning when the cops found Anna Caldwell's body. Anna was a schoolteacher, loved by everyone. She taught second grade at Oakshade Elementary, and she wasn't just the teacher of the year type. She was the person you'd go to for advice, a shoulder to cry on, the real deal. But on that morning, when her body turned up in the basement of St. Gideon's Church, the whole town stopped in its tracks. It wasn't a random spot to find her. Anna had been close with the church, volunteered there almost every weekend. But nobody expected this. The room where she was found wasn't even supposed to exist. It was tucked behind an old storage area, practically hidden. Someone had gone to great lengths to make sure she stayed out of sight. The details of the scene? Absolutely chilling. Beside Anna lay a chalice, an object that puzzled investigators. It had stains that seemed directly connected to what had happened during the incident. Authorities later confirmed that Anna had been the victim of a tragic and intentional act, leaving the community searching for answers. When Detective Ethan Cole rolled into town, people breathed a little easier. Ethan's the type you'd want on your side. A sharp mind, no nonsense, with a track record of cracking tough cases. But even he looked rattled when he saw what had happened. The scene was one thing, but the setting? That's what made it worse. St. Gideon's was supposed to be a place of peace, a refuge. And now it was the center of something evil. Ethan started asking questions right away, piecing together who Anna was and what might have brought her to such a horrible end. It didn't take long for whispers to start spreading around town. You'd hear them at the coffee shop, in line at the grocery store, people saying things like, "Who could do something like this?" But you'd also hear the darker stuff. "Did you hear about Father James? I heard he and Anna didn't see eye to eye." Father James was the pastor at St. Gideon's. Quiet guy, always polite. But there was something about him that didn't sit right with everyone. And then, when Ethan started digging, things got even murkier. Anna had been keeping a diary, and in it, she'd written about someone she called the man in the dark. The entries didn't name names, but they painted a picture of someone who scared her a lot. One passage even mentioned how she felt uneasy around Father James. But let me back up for a second. This is Oakshade. People here don't turn on each other easily. When Ethan started poking around Father James, half the town was ready to defend him to the death. Father James would never hurt anyone, they'd say. Others weren't so sure. They'd seen little things over the years, nothing major, but enough to wonder if the man behind the pulpit wasn't as holy as he seemed. And it wasn't just about Anna's unease. Ethan found out that in the weeks leading up to her death, Anna had been asking questions, big questions, about the church's finances. She'd been helping out with some bookkeeping, and apparently, something didn't add up. Elise Harrington, the church secretary, told Ethan that Anna had confided in her. She said she couldn't shake the feeling that something shady was going on, Elise admitted. Of course, when Ethan pressed Father James about it, the man claimed innocence. He said he didn't know what Anna was talking about, that his books were clean, and that he'd never seen anything suspicious. But his alibi for the night Anna was killed? Pretty flimsy. He said he'd been at home alone, reading, which conveniently left no witnesses to back him up. As Ethan worked the case, the town's picture-perfect facade started to crack. Secrets came crawling out of the woodwork like roaches. People started looking at each other differently, second-guessing their friends, their neighbors. It was the kind of ripple effect that can tear a tight-knit community apart. But what really shook everyone wasn't just Anna's death. It was the idea that this town, their town, could hold so much darkness. The image of Anna's body in that hidden room stuck with people. You'd see it in their eyes when they walked past the church, or when they spoke about her in hushed tones at the diner. And then there was the chalice. The police hadn't said much about it publicly, but word still got out. A tarnished, stained chalice sitting beside her. It wasn't something people could easily explain away. Some folks thought it had to mean something, like Anna had stumbled onto some sort of secret ritual, or that it was tied to whatever financial mess she'd been uncovering. Others thought it was just a sick way to send a message. Either way, it gave the whole thing an almost unreal quality, like something out of a true crime special you'd see on TV. But to Ethan, it was all too real. The way he saw it, the chalice was either a clue or a distraction. Either way, he couldn't ignore it. So he kept digging, trying to get to the bottom of what happened in St. Gideon's that night. And as he did, it became clear that the answers weren't going to come easy. The more Ethan learned about Anna, the more he realized she wasn't just a victim. She was the key to everything. If he could figure out what she knew, what she'd uncovered, he'd get closer to solving the case. But with the town divided and everyone holding onto their secrets, getting to the truth was going to be like pulling teeth. This wasn't the kind of story that was going to end neatly. That much was obvious from the start. What nobody realized, not even Ethan, was just how deep this thing went, and how many lives it would destroy before it was over. The investigation into Anna Caldwell's death began with a methodical dive into her life, but let's not sugarcoat it. This wasn't your standard, look at the victim's schedule and find a suspect kind of case. Detective Ethan Cole knew that right off the bat. The details of the crime, the cryptic setting, and the eerie feeling that something bigger was at play made this investigation different. The first thing Ethan did was retrace Anna's steps. Her house on Maple Drive was as cozy as they came. Photos of smiling students, stacks of lesson plans, and a shelf crammed with mystery novels spoke of a life dedicated to teaching and the community. But amidst the warmth of her home, something darker was hidden. Tucked away in a drawer, Ethan found a journal. It wasn't just any journal. This was Anna's window into her own fears. The diary wasn't long, but it was chilling. Her handwriting became shakier with each entry, and her words hinted at a growing paranoia. One phrase kept coming up, the man in the dark. At first, it sounded like a character from one of her mystery novels, but the way Anna wrote about him made it clear he was real. She didn't name him, but she talked about how he would watch her too closely and how being alone with him made her skin crawl. What really stood out were her comments about St. Gideon's Church and Father James. Something is wrong there, she wrote in one entry. I need to figure it out. But what if he knows? Another entry, dated just a week before her death, read, I can't shake the feeling he's hiding something terrible. I don't know who I can trust anymore. Ethan's next stop was St. Gideon's Church. If Anna had concerns about the place, he needed to understand why. On the surface, the church looked as serene and welcoming as ever. Its pristine stained glass windows cast colorful patterns across the neatly aligned pews, and the atmosphere carried the quiet reverence of faith. Father James, the pastor, was well known for his eloquent sermons and calm demeanor, a figure many in the community admired deeply. But Ethan wasn't there for appearances. He was looking for answers. The church secretary, Elise Harrington, was a detail-oriented woman who noticed much more than she let on. Although she wasn't one to share gossip, her responses to Ethan's questions hinted at something deeper. Anna, she revealed, had been unusually focused on the church's accounts in the weeks before her death. She had taken an intense interest in the finances, raising questions that Elise hadn't given much thought to at the time. However, as the days passed, Anna's persistence grew, and it became clear she was troubled by something specific. Elise also mentioned that Anna's inquiries extended beyond finances. She had expressed growing unease and seemed convinced that there was more beneath the surface. Anna's determination, coupled with her increasing anxiety, left a lingering impression on Elise, even if she couldn't fully grasp the depth of what Anna had uncovered. Ethan then turned his attention to Father James. The pastor welcomed him in his small, orderly office, exuding the same calm demeanor he was known for. He offered assurances of cooperation and expressed sorrow over Anna's passing, describing her as a valued member of the church community. However, as Ethan pressed for details, Father James's responses, while composed, left questions unanswered. He claimed to have spent the evening at home alone on the night Anna was found. The lack of an alibi raised suspicions, but his steady tone and lack of visible distress made it difficult to read him clearly. When asked about the church's finances, Father James firmly denied any irregularities, maintaining that everything was in order. He gave no indication of being aware of Anna's concerns, insisting that if she had approached him, he would have addressed her questions promptly. Yet, Ethan couldn't ignore the feeling that Father James's calmness bordered on practiced. It was as though he had prepared for such inquiries long before Ethan ever walked into his office. As news of Anna's death and the ongoing investigation spread, the small town of Oakshade began to feel the strain. Discussions at the diner and local shops revealed a community grappling with doubt and speculation. Many residents continued to stand by Father James, pointing to his years of service and the positive influence he had on the town. To them, the idea of his involvement in anything questionable seemed unthinkable. Others, however, weren't so sure. Quiet whispers began to circulate about past financial discrepancies and the mysterious circumstances surrounding his transfer to Oakshade from another parish. Ethan heard many of these whispers during casual conversations around town. Some community members mentioned unexplained gaps in the church's budget, while others hinted that Father James's previous assignment had ended abruptly for reasons never fully explained. The suspicion grew, feeding a quiet divide in the town. Those who once found solace in the church now began to question the man leading it. Ethan's investigation took another turn when Elise Harrington mentioned something unusual during a second conversation. She described a man who had started appearing at the church a few months earlier. His presence was irregular, but it hadn't gone unnoticed. The man, Patrick Warren, was a private investigator, and Father James had apparently hired him to address what he called a potential threat to the church. While Elise couldn't say much about Patrick's purpose, the mere fact that a pastor had brought in an investigator to handle church matters struck Ethan as unusual. Ethan began to piece together what this could mean. The fact that Father James felt the need to hire someone like Patrick suggested that whatever Anna had uncovered might have been bigger than anyone in Oakshade realized. Ethan couldn't ignore the mounting evidence that the seemingly saintly facade of St. Gideon's Church and its pastor was beginning to crack. Ethan added Patrick Warren to his growing list of people to track down, but for now, he focused on the fractures appearing in the town. The closer he got to Father James, the more divided Oakshade became. It wasn't just about the pastor anymore, it was about trust. If Father James could be involved in something as dark as this, what else had the town overlooked? As Ethan dug deeper into Anna's life and the church's dealings, it became clear that this case was a lot bigger than one victim and one suspect. The question wasn't just who killed Anna, it was why. And the answers, Ethan suspected, were going to shake this town to its core. Detective Ethan Cole knew there was more to Father James than his calm demeanor let on, and it was time to dig deeper. If there was one thing Ethan had learned over years of investigations, it was that people who worked hard to seem squeaky clean often had the most to hide. The first cracks in Father James's story came when Ethan pulled his transfer records. Oakshade wasn't his first parish, as most locals assumed. Before arriving in the picturesque town, Father James had been stationed in Rochester, New York. At first glance, it seemed like a straightforward career move, but Ethan's instincts told him otherwise. He dug into public records and diocesan announcements, and what he found raised alarm bells. Father James's transfer to Oakshade wasn't a promotion. It was damage control. Rochester parishioners had quietly reported him for unbecoming conduct and questionable management practices. Nothing criminal on paper, but the vague language in the reports left plenty of room for interpretation. Ethan reached out to contacts in Rochester, and one retired parish council member didn't hold back. "We had questions about where the money was going," the man told Ethan over the phone. Church renovations were supposed to cost 30 grand, but the invoices came back for nearly double that. James always had some smooth explanation, but it didn't sit right with a lot of us. Ethan followed the money. He subpoenaed financial records for St. Gideon's Church, hoping they might shed some light on Father James's current activities. It didn't take long to spot the red flags. Over the past 6 months, large withdrawals had been made from the church's account, with vague notations like miscellaneous expenses and building maintenance. The amounts were too big to ignore, and the lack of documentation set off alarms. Ethan had seen this pattern before. It screamed embezzlement. Confronting Father James about the discrepancies was the next step, but Ethan wanted to be fully armed with facts before he walked back into that office. Instead, he focused on gathering witness testimony. Conversations with church staff and regulars painted a picture of a man who wasn't as saintly as his sermons suggested. One volunteer remembered Anna Caldwell and Father James arguing in the church hallway just weeks before her death. "It wasn't loud," she said, "but you could feel the tension." She was pointing at a stack of papers and saying something like, "This isn't right." He kept trying to wave her off, saying it was all above board, but she wouldn't drop it. Another witness, a custodian who worked odd hours at the church, recalled a heated exchange late one evening. "I heard her voice," the custodian said. "She sounded upset, like she was accusing him of something. He kept telling her to leave it alone, that she didn't understand how these things worked." She stormed out not long after. Anna, it seemed, had been poking her nose into places Father James didn't want her to go. But had that been enough to cost her life? The investigation took another turn when Ethan obtained surveillance footage from a street camera near the church. The footage, grainy but clear enough, showed a man entering St. Gideon's Church on the night of Anna's death. He wasn't Father James, but Ethan didn't recognize him either. The timestamp on the footage was just hours before Anna's body was discovered. Ethan shared the image with local officers and began asking around town, but nobody could identify the man. The presence of this unknown visitor raised unsettling questions. Who was he, and what was he doing at the church so late? More importantly, was he connected to Anna's death? Ethan knew that to find out, he needed to press harder on Father James. When Ethan confronted him about the financial discrepancies, the pastor's calm exterior showed its first crack. "Those withdrawals were for church business," Father James said, his voice a little too steady. "Repairs, community events, donations to the needy. Then why can't you provide invoices or receipts?" Ethan shot back. Father James hesitated. "Some of the records were misplaced during a recent office reorganization. I assure you, everything was done in good faith." Ethan leaned forward. Good faith doesn't explain tens of thousands of dollars vanishing without a trace. And it sure doesn't explain why Anna Caldwell was so concerned about those same finances. The pastor's expression hardened, but he said nothing. Ethan had seen the look before. It wasn't innocence, it was resistance. Father James wasn't going to give anything up voluntarily. As word of Ethan's discoveries began to spread, the town's trust in Father James started to crumble. Those who had once defended him now whispered about the rumors of his past. Parishioners who had attended his sermons for years began skipping Sunday services, their faith in him shaken. The church, once a pillar of the community, became a symbol of uncertainty and distrust. At the same time, tensions rose among Oakshade's residents. Some felt betrayed, wondering how they could have been so blind to what was happening right under their noses. Others clung to their loyalty, insisting that Father James was being unfairly targeted. "People love to drag a good man's name through the mud," one parishioner told a local reporter. "This is nothing but a witch hunt." But Ethan wasn't swayed by public opinion. He focused on the facts, and every fact pointed to Father James being at the center of something far bigger than a simple embezzlement scheme. The pastor's secrets were spilling into the open, and they weren't just about money. They were about power, deception, and a growing suspicion that Anna Caldwell's death wasn't random. Ethan didn't know who the man in the surveillance footage was yet, but he was sure of one thing. Father James knew more than he was letting on. And as the town's once unified front began to fracture, Ethan realized that exposing the truth about the pastor wasn't just about solving Anna's death. It was about bringing justice to a community that had put its trust in the wrong man. Detective Ethan Cole felt the case tightening around him like a noose. Identifying the man in the surveillance footage had been a breakthrough, but what he uncovered in the days that followed turned everything on its head. The man, Patrick Warren, was no ordinary bystander. He was a private investigator with a track record that raised eyebrows and hinted at a history of questionable decisions. Patrick wasn't a local. His office was in the nearby town of Milford, a place far enough from Oakshade to avoid familiarity, but close enough for convenience. Patrick's name rang a few bells when Ethan ran it through the system. His work history wasn't filled with criminal convictions, but it didn't exactly paint a picture of a law-abiding professional. He had a reputation for taking on delicate cases, the kind where the client didn't want to get their hands dirty. This wasn't the kind of man you'd expect to see linked to a small-town church like St. Gideon's. Ethan found Patrick in his rundown office, the kind of place where people went when they had nowhere else to turn. The PI tried to deflect questions at first, playing the typical, "I don't know what you're talking about" card, but Ethan wasn't having it. He presented the surveillance footage and laid out the timeline, piece by piece, until Patrick's bravado crumbled. Under the weight of mounting evidence, he finally started talking. Father James, Patrick admitted, had hired him several months ago. The pastor had approached him with what he described as a delicate problem. Someone was poking around in church matters, and he needed it handled quietly. Patrick's job, according to his account, was to monitor Anna Caldwell. At first, the assignment sounded simple. Keep an eye on her, report her movements, and discourage her from continuing her inquiries. Discourage was a loaded term, and Ethan pressed Patrick on what exactly that meant. After some hesitation, Patrick admitted to confronting Anna on more than one occasion. He'd warned her to drop her investigation into the church's finances and stop asking questions. "I didn't hurt her," he said repeatedly, as if trying to convince himself as much as Ethan. "I just tried to talk some sense into her." But it wasn't just about the money, Patrick revealed. Anna had stumbled onto something much more personal. Father James's child, born out of wedlock years ago. It was a secret that threatened not just the pastor's reputation, but the trust he'd cultivated in the community. Patrick confessed that Anna had planned to confront Father James about everything, determined to hold him accountable. Patrick also admitted to being at St. Gideon's the night Anna died. His explanation was that he'd gone there to reason with her one last time, hoping to de-escalate the situation. He claimed he left her alive, but Ethan wasn't convinced. Patrick's presence at the church on that fateful night was a critical piece of the puzzle, and while he denied any direct involvement in Anna's death, his actions undeniably played a role in the events leading up to it. With Patrick's confession in hand, Ethan's understanding of the case deepened. What began as a single investigation into Anna's tragic death had now become a tangled web of lies, secrets, and manipulation. Father James, once a revered figure in Oakshade, now stood at the center of a storm that threatened to tear the town apart. Ethan went back through the church's financial records with fresh eyes, focusing on the discrepancies Anna had been investigating. The withdrawals from the church's accounts weren't just large. They were frequent, poorly documented, and highly suspicious. Vague notations like outreach programs and building repairs were listed next to amounts that couldn't possibly add up. Combined with Patrick's testimony, the financial evidence painted a clear picture. Father James had been funneling money out of the church for years, using its accounts as his personal piggy bank. The new revelations sent shockwaves through Oakshade. The community, already shaken by Anna's death, now faced the possibility that their trusted pastor was at the center of a scandal that went far beyond financial misconduct. The discovery of Father James's secret child only added fuel to the fire. As the rumors spread, the town's once unified faith began to fracture. People whispered in hushed tones at the diner, speculated at the grocery store, and exchanged knowing looks at church services. Meanwhile, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that Patrick wasn't telling him the whole story. The PI's involvement was clear, but was he really just a pawn in Father James's scheme? Or did he have his own motives? The financial misdeeds and personal scandals were enough to give Father James a motive, but Patrick's presence at the church that night complicated things. Ethan returned to St. Gideon's to revisit the crime scene. The hidden room where Anna's body was found still carried an eerie silence, its air heavy with unanswered questions. The stained chalice, the most haunting element of the scene, still felt like a message, but from whom? And why? As Ethan walked through the church, he began to see it as more than just a building. It was a symbol, both of the community's faith and the dark secrets hidden beneath the surface. The stained glass windows, once a source of beauty and light, now seemed to cast long shadows across the pews. The more Ethan uncovered, the more it became clear that St. Gideon's had been a stage for a performance that had gone on far too long. The case wasn't just about Anna anymore. It was about the systems and people who had allowed deception to thrive in the heart of Oakshade. Father James wasn't the only one with questions to answer, and Patrick wasn't the only one complicit in the lies. The deeper Ethan dug, the clearer it became that Anna's death was the result of years of secrets coming to a head. The community, once a tight-knit haven, now found itself divided by suspicion and betrayal. Attendance at St. Gideon's dropped sharply, and whispers about Father James grew louder with each passing day. Friends turned on each other, neighbors exchanged wary glances, and the peace Oakshade had once cherished seemed like a distant memory. Ethan knew he was only beginning to scratch the surface. Patrick's confession had opened the door to a larger conspiracy, but the full scope of what Anna had uncovered, and what it had cost her, was still coming into focus. The deeper Ethan went, the more he realized that the web of deceit surrounding Father James reached further than he'd imagined. And as he pieced together the puzzle, he couldn't shake the feeling that the truth, when it finally came to light, would change Oakshade forever. Ethan Cole's investigation into Anna Caldwell's death had reached a boiling point. It felt like every new clue added another layer of lies, pulling him deeper into a web of deceit that wrapped around St. Gideon's Church and, most importantly, Father James. Ethan wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, but the more he dug, the clearer it became that Father James wasn't the man everyone thought he was. The key was Anna's diary. It wasn't just filled with her day-to-day thoughts. It was practically a map of her investigation into the church's secrets. In her final entries, she wrote about uncovering strange withdrawals from the church's accounts and her growing suspicion that Father James was hiding something personal. Anna had made up her mind. She was going to confront him, to demand answers. But the way she wrote about it, you could tell she was nervous. There were notes about someone watching her, a fear that seemed to follow her everywhere. Still, she pressed on. Ethan started connecting the dots. The church's financial records backed up everything Anna had been worried about. The withdrawals she mentioned were real. Thousands of dollars were being taken out, labeled for vague things like outreach or maintenance. But when Ethan followed the money trail, those funds didn't seem to go toward any projects at the church. Instead, they disappeared into private accounts tied directly to Father James. It was clear as day. This wasn't an accounting error. It was a deliberate cover-up. The next big piece of evidence came from Patrick Warren, the private investigator Father James had hired. Payments to Patrick were buried in the church's financial records, disguised as consulting fees. Ethan matched those payments to the timeline in Anna's diary, and it was obvious that Patrick's job was to keep her quiet. Father James wasn't just worried about her finding out about the money. Anna had also uncovered his biggest secret, a child he'd fathered years ago. This wasn't just a scandal. It was the kind of thing that could destroy a man's reputation, especially someone like Father James, whose entire career relied on being seen as a moral, upright leader. Ethan didn't just have records and timelines. He also had people willing to talk. Elise Harrington, the church secretary, admitted that she'd overheard a heated argument between Anna and Father James not long before Anna's death. According to Elise, Anna had accused him of betrayal, and Father James had fired back, warning her not to cross him. At the time, Elise hadn't thought much of it, but now, with everything that had come to light, she realized just how serious it was. And then there was Father James's alibi, or rather, the lack of one. He'd told Ethan he was home alone, reading scripture, on the night Anna was found. But there was no one to back him up, no evidence to confirm his story. It was the weakest excuse Ethan had heard in a while, and it didn't take much digging to poke holes in it. And then, just as Ethan was ready to pull the trigger, he uncovered something that changed everything. While reviewing old records, Ethan stumbled upon a case from 5 years earlier. It was in Rochester, where Father James had served before coming to Oakshade. A young woman named Margaret Lawson had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The police report described her as a dedicated parishioner who had been volunteering at the church. She'd been digging into financial discrepancies, trying to figure out why funds meant for community projects kept vanishing. And then, one day, she was just gone. The similarities were chilling. Margaret, like Anna, had uncovered troubling secrets about the church. Both women had been vocal about their concerns. Both had drawn the wrong kind of attention, and both had been silenced. The pattern was too strong to ignore. Ethan reached out to contacts in Rochester to get more details about Margaret's case. Witnesses described her as determined and outspoken, a woman who wasn't afraid to stand up for what she believed in. But as she dug deeper into the church's finances, she started to isolate herself, telling friends she was worried about what she was uncovering. The case had gone cold years ago, but now, in light of Anna's death, it was impossible not to see the connection. This revelation reframed everything. Anna's death wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a larger, more sinister pattern. Father James wasn't just a man protecting his reputation. He was part of something bigger, something darker. And the closer Ethan got to the truth, the more he realized how far this conspiracy might go. The realization hit Ethan hard. He wasn't just dealing with a single case anymore. He was unraveling years of deceit and destruction. The arrest of Father James was only the beginning. There were bigger questions to answer, bigger forces at play. As he prepared to take Father James into custody, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The investigation into Anna Caldwell's death had become much more than anyone could have anticipated. The diary entries, the financial records, and the witness testimony were all damning. But now there was a pattern, a history of lives ruined and secrets buried. Ethan was closing in, confident he was piecing it all together. But what nobody in Oakshade realized, what no one could have expected, was that Anna Caldwell's death wouldn't be the last. Sunday mornings in Oakshade were sacred, and St. Gideon's Church was always packed. Families filled the pews, neighbors exchanged quick smiles, and the sound of hymns drifted through the stained glass windows. But this particular Sunday was different. All that peace and routine shattered when Detective Ethan Cole walked in with a pair of officers. It wasn't just a visit, either. He was there to arrest Father James. The moment Ethan stepped through the doors, the congregation froze. You could have heard a pin drop as Ethan made his way to the front. Father James was standing at the pulpit, mid-sermon, when he noticed the detective. There was no running, no protesting. The man just stood there, his face pale, hands trembling slightly as Ethan walked up to him. The congregation watched in stunned silence as the pastor, their spiritual leader, was led out of the church in handcuffs. Some people started crying, others muttered in disbelief, and a few just sat there, frozen in shock. Outside, a small group of protesters, folks who had been debating Father James's innocence for weeks, stood with their signs, looking just as stunned. The arrest was the talk of the town within minutes. Oakshade wasn't the kind of place where you could keep something like that quiet. Phones lit up with texts and calls, and by the time Father James reached the station, it felt like every single person in town had an opinion. Some folks were furious, convinced the detective was targeting an innocent man. Others felt a grim satisfaction, like the truth was finally catching up to someone who thought he was untouchable. Back at the station, Ethan didn't waste time laying out the charges. He had the financial records, the testimony, and Anna Caldwell's diary. It all painted a picture of a man who had spent years covering his tracks, embezzling church funds, intimidating anyone who got too close to the truth, and using his position of trust to shield himself from suspicion. Father James didn't say much during booking. He didn't argue or lash out, just quietly answered questions when asked. It was hard to tell if he was trying to stay calm, or if he was just defeated. While the arrest was a big win for the case, Ethan knew it wasn't over. There were still too many loose ends, especially with Patrick Warren, the private investigator Father James had hired. Patrick had already agreed to testify, and his statement would have been the nail in the coffin. But something about Patrick's cooperation felt off. The man had been visibly nervous when Ethan last spoke to him, constantly looking over his shoulder, muttering about how he was making himself a target. Ethan hadn't pushed at the time. Patrick was a valuable witness, and the last thing he wanted was to scare him off. Then, 2 days later, Ethan got the call. Patrick Warren was dead. The motel where Patrick had been staying was a run-down place on the outskirts of town. When Ethan arrived, the scene didn't sit right with him. At first glance, it looked like a tragic accident, a wound, a note left on the nightstand, no signs of a struggle. But something about it was too clean, too perfect. The evidence had been carefully cleaned, the note felt generic, and Patrick's body was positioned in a way that raised more questions than answers. Forensics backed up Ethan's instincts. The item in question had no fingerprints on it, Patrick's or anyone else's. The handwriting on the note didn't match the samples Ethan had collected earlier, and the ballistics told a story that didn't line up with what the scene was trying to sell. This wasn't just a tragic accident. It was staged. Ethan's first thought was that Father James might have ordered it. After all, Patrick had been set to testify against him, and his death conveniently removed a major piece of evidence from the case. But when Ethan confronted Father James about it, the pastor seemed genuinely shocked. He denied everything, claiming he'd already lost enough and had no reason to make things worse for himself. Ethan wasn't sure if he believed him, but deep down, he suspected there was more to this than just Father James. Patrick's death raised a question Ethan hadn't wanted to ask before. Was Father James acting alone? It seemed less and less likely. The level of planning and precision it took to stage Patrick's death wasn't something Ethan thought the pastor could have pulled off from a jail cell. Someone else was out there, someone who had a vested interest in keeping Patrick quiet. Ethan started digging into Patrick's recent movements. The private investigator had been involved in plenty of shady cases over the years, and not all of them were tied to Father James. There were other clients, other secrets, and other people who might have wanted him silenced. But Patrick's work for the pastor stood out. It wasn't just the money. Though the payments Father James had made to him were substantial, it was the timing. Patrick had been hired right around the time Anna Caldwell started asking questions. Ethan had to focus on the facts, and the facts were pointing to something much bigger than just Father James. Patrick's death wasn't random. It was part of the same web of lies that had claimed Anna's life. Someone was working hard to keep the truth buried, and they were willing to do anything for it. The whole case was starting to spiral. Ethan had gone from investigating a single death to unraveling a conspiracy that stretched further than he'd imagined. The arrest of Father James was just one piece of the puzzle, and as satisfying as it had been to bring him in, it was becoming clear that the pastor wasn't the only one responsible for crimes. Ethan spent hours piecing together the evidence, trying to figure out who else might be involved. The church's financial records, Anna's diary, and Patrick's past cases all hinted at a larger network of corruption, but nothing definitive had emerged yet. All Ethan knew for sure was that someone out there still had a lot to lose, and they weren't done fighting to keep their secrets safe. The arrest had felt like the beginning of the end, but now Ethan realized it was just the start. Patrick's death wasn't the conclusion of this case. It was the opening to something even darker. And if Ethan wanted to see justice served, he'd have to figure out who was pulling the strings before anyone else ended up dead. The trial of Father James was the most anticipated event in Oakshade's history. Packed courtrooms, reporters in every corner, and a community divided. The evidence against him, financial records, Anna's diary, witness testimonies, and Patrick Warren's statements, left no doubt in the jury's mind. After weeks of deliberation, the verdict was delivered. Guilty on all counts, including Anna Caldwell's death and large-scale financial crimes. Father James was sentenced to life in prison without parole, his fall from grace complete. But the trial wasn't just about convicting Father James. It also uncovered a new player in the conspiracy. Thomas Riker, a disgraced ex-deacon who had served under Father James in his previous parish in Rochester. During testimony, hidden communications between Riker and Father James were revealed. Emails and texts painted a picture of a man who had been complicit in covering up Father James's financial misdeeds and other secrets for years. Ethan Cole dug into Riker's background and discovered a history of suspicious activity. Riker had been quietly forced out of his deacon role after several allegations of misconduct, though nothing had stuck well enough to lead to charges. His involvement with Father James, however, never ended. When Patrick Warren agreed to testify, it was Riker who panicked. Knowing that Warren's statements would implicate him in the larger conspiracy, Riker decided to silence Patrick himself. Ethan traced Riker's steps the night Patrick Warren was killed. Surveillance footage from the motel showed Riker arriving hours before Patrick's death, and DNA evidence recovered from the scene confirmed his presence. The staged accident had been his desperate attempt to cover his tracks, but it was sloppily executed. Under questioning, Riker eventually broke down and confessed. He admitted that Father James had ordered Patrick to intimidate Anna, but claimed that Warren's death had been his decision alone. With Riker's arrest, the full scope of the crimes came into focus. Anna had uncovered not just Father James's financial misdeeds, but also Riker's involvement in covering them up. Her determination to expose the truth made her a target, and Patrick Warren became collateral damage when he turned on his former employer. The aftermath of the case left a deep scar on Oakshade. St. Gideon's Church was permanently closed, its reputation tarnished beyond repair. The once trusting community faced the hard task of rebuilding after the betrayal by one of its most respected leaders. For Ethan Cole, the resolution was bittersweet. Justice had been served for Anna Caldwell and Patrick Warren, but the cost to the town and himself had been steep. As Oakshade slowly began to heal, Ethan found solace in knowing the truth was finally out. The lies were laid bare, and the town could finally start to move forward, proving that even in the face of profound betrayal, rebuilding was possible.